Egypt at midnight. The delta is dark and the air has gone still in a way that feels deliberate. In the brickworkers' settlements along the eastern margin of the Nile Valley, families are standing dressed, sandals on, staffs in hand, eating in the kind of silence that says they do not expect to be here by morning. Blood has been painted across the door frames of their houses. Across the city, in the great administrative compounds and the palace district and the servants' quarters of every wealthy household, something is moving through the darkness. Something that does not knock. By dawn, there is not a house in Egypt without its grief. The wailing carries from one end of the delta to the other, and somewhere in the darkness before first light, a vast and frightened people is gathering its children and its livestock and the bread it could not wait to leaven, walking toward a wilderness it has never seen, carrying the bones of a man named Joseph. This is Bible Stories Unearthed, where we retell the narratives of Scripture alongside the history, archaeology, and ancient world that give them their full weight. Today, the foundational story of the Hebrew Scriptures, the liberation of the Israelites from Egypt, the 10 plagues, the crossing of the sea, and what the ancient world can and cannot tell us about the long road out. To understand the world the Exodus begins in, you have to stand in the eastern Nile Delta and look at what surrounds you. Mud, sun, the smell of the river, and everywhere, the evidence of an empire that runs on organized human labor at a scale almost impossible to comprehend. The temples and colossi of New Kingdom Egypt, roughly the 16th through 11th centuries BC, were not built by a workforce of thousands. They were built by a workforce of hundreds of thousands, administered by a bureaucracy that tracked grain deliveries, labor rosters, and brick quotas with meticulous precision. Egypt in this era dominated the ancient world from Nubia to Syria, and its eastern delta was the empire's crowded, productive frontier. For centuries, that frontier had drawn Semitic-speaking people from Canaan. Some came as traders, many were absorbed, willingly or otherwise, into the state's labor machinery. Egyptian papyri from this period document Asiatic workers in state construction projects, recording names, rations, and assignments. The picture of a Semitic-speaking community performing heavy labor in Egypt is not an idea the biblical text introduces into the ancient record. It is already there before the narrative begins. The region the biblical text calls Ramesses, identified by most Egyptologists with a site in the eastern delta known today as Tel el-Daba, had an older, charged history. In a previous era, it had been Avaris, the capital of the Hyksos, a Semitic-speaking people who dominated Lower Egypt between roughly 1650 and 1550 BC before being expelled by native Egyptian dynasties reasserting control. The eastern delta was not neutral ground. It was a landscape where Semitic and Egyptian worlds had collided before. And it is the world into which the Book of Exodus drops us without preamble. The Book of Exodus opens in fear. A new king has risen over Egypt, one who did not know Joseph. The Israelites, the descendants of Jacob's 12 sons who had come to Egypt during a famine generations earlier under Joseph's protection, have multiplied. Too much so, in this new Pharaoh's estimation. He sets taskmasters over them. They are put to work building store cities. The biblical text names them Pithom and Ramesses. The labor is designed to reduce them. it does not. As the population continues to grow, Pharaoh escalates. Midwives are instructed to kill Hebrew boys at birth. When that order fails, the midwives, the text records with quiet precision, feared God more than Pharaoh. He commands that every newborn Hebrew son be thrown into the Nile. Into this world, a child is born. His mother hides him for 3 months. When concealment becomes impossible, she places him in a basket of woven reeds, waterproofed with tar and pitch, and sets it at the river's edge. He is found by Pharaoh's own daughter, who takes him home and raises him in the royal household. His name, the narrative records, is Moses. Moses grows to manhood in Pharaoh's court. The day he strikes and kills an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave, his two worlds collide and he flees, east across the Sinai into the land of Midian. He marries, tends flocks, and lives at the margin of the wilderness. Decades pass, until, on the mountain of God, a bush burns and is not consumed. The encounter at Horeb, also called Sinai, is the hinge of the entire narrative. Moses receives not just a commission but a name, I am who I am. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is identifying himself in terms that will anchor a theological tradition for 3,000 years. His instruction is direct. Go back to Egypt. Tell Pharaoh to release my people. Bring them out to this mountain. Moses returns. With his brother Aaron, he presents himself before Pharaoh and delivers the demand, "Let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's response is contemptuous. He does not know this God. He will not release this workforce. The labor quotas are increased, and the confrontation begins. The 10 plagues that follow are not simply escalating pressure tactics. They have a structure, and understanding that structure deepens what the text is doing. Scholars have noted that the plagues move systematically through the domains that governed Egyptian religious and material life. The Nile, upon which the entire civilization depended. The animals, which were sacred in Egyptian religion and central to its economy. The sky and the sun, over which the most powerful Egyptian deities were believed to preside. And finally, human life itself. The water of the Nile turns to blood. Frogs swarm out of the river in numbers that overwhelm the land. Lice or gnats emerge from the dust. Flies follow. Livestock across Egypt fall sick and die. Cattle, horses, donkeys, camels. Boils break out on people and animals alike, and when Moses scatters handfuls of ash into the air before Pharaoh, the breakout is immediate and total. Hail, unlike anything in living memory, destroys the crops and animals still in the open fields. Locusts consume what the hail left standing. Then darkness, thick, unbroken darkness across Egypt for 3 days. A darkness, the text says, that can be felt. Only in the Israelite settlements is there light. Each time the pressure mounts, the narrative describes Pharaoh relenting and then hardening again. Sometimes of his own will, sometimes hardened explicitly by God. The text does not try to resolve the tension in this. What it insists on is something larger. The plagues are not merely instruments of negotiation. They are a declaration directed at the most powerful ruler in the known world. I am the Lord. There is none like me in all the earth. Before the 10th and final blow, Moses gives the Israelites their instructions for what the text calls Passover. A lamb, one per household, slaughtered at twilight. Its blood painted across the lintel and the 2 doorposts. The animal roasted and eaten that same night, sandals on, belt fastened, staff in hand, ready to move. When the destroyer passes through Egypt and the firstborn die, the marked houses will be passed over. The distinction is absolute. By morning, Egypt is in mourning from one end to the other. Pharaoh releases them. The number of those who leave is recorded in the text as 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude, non-Israelites, goes with them. They carry silver and gold and clothing pressed on them by their Egyptian neighbors. They carry unleavened bread because there was no time to wait for it to rise. And they carry the bones of Joseph, who made the Israelites swear generations earlier that when God remembered them and brought them out, they would carry him back to the land of his ancestors. The route Exodus describes avoids the direct coastal road north to Canaan. The text is explicit that God led them away from it, lest they encounter war and lose their nerve. They move south and east into the wilderness, guided by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Pharaoh changes his mind. He musters his chariotry and his army and gives chase. He finds them camped at the sea, with nowhere left to go. Trapped between the advancing Egyptian forces and the water, the people cry out in terror. Moses speaks into the panic. Stand firm. Watch what God will do today. The Egyptians you see this morning, you will not see them again. The text records that a strong east wind blows through the night. The water divides. The Israelites walk through on dry ground, with walls of water on their right and their left. The Egyptian army follows them onto the seabed. The water returns. When the Israelites reach the far shore, the text records what they do next. The Song of the Sea, the longer poem of Exodus 15, one of the oldest surviving compositions in the Hebrew Scriptures, breaks out in full. And then Miriam, the sister of Moses, takes a tambourine and leads the women in song and in dance, repeating the refrain that opens it. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The long road out has just begun. Canaan is still 40 years away. Egypt kept records. This is one of the most significant facts about the Exodus question. The New Kingdom administration documented military campaigns, labor assignments, harvest yields, diplomatic correspondence, and the movements of foreign workers with considerable thoroughness. The Exodus, as the biblical text describes it, 10 successive divine plagues, the unraveling of a national labor force, and the destruction of a chariot army, has left no confirmed trace in any Egyptian document recovered to date. That absence sits differently depending on which part of the record you examine. Egyptian monumental architecture, temple inscriptions, victory stelae, royal proclamations, was explicitly propagandistic. Defeats were suppressed, reversals were reframed, and pharaohs who lost battles sometimes had their names chiseled off monuments entirely. This is documented. The argument that a catastrophic reversal would simply not appear in official royal inscriptions is not without basis. But the mainstream historical objection goes further than that. Egypt also produced administrative papyri, internal logistical records that were not public propaganda. These tracked grain reserves, labor rosters, tax yields, and economic conditions at the ground level. A loss of the magnitude the biblical account describes. a workforce potentially numbering in the millions, agricultural devastation across multiple growing seasons, and the destruction of a military force would be expected to leave traces in these administrative documents. None have been found. Most Egyptologists do not consider the suppression of public records argument sufficient to explain the total absence from the administrative record as well. The population figures the text provides present a related challenge. 600,000 men on foot, plus women, children, and a mixed multitude, implies a total group that most demographers estimate at somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million people. Egypt's total population during the New Kingdom is itself estimated by scholars at somewhere in the range of 3 to 4 million. The logistical and demographic implications of a literal reading of this figure for the Egyptian economy, for the carrying capacity of the Sinai wilderness, and for the subsequent archaeology of Canaan are considered physically untenable by mainstream historians and archaeologists. Scholars have proposed various alternative readings. That the Hebrew word translated as thousand may in some contexts denote a military unit or clan grouping of much smaller size, or that the figures were shaped by later scribal or theological traditions. None of these proposals has achieved consensus, but the mainstream position is clear. A literal reading of 2+ million is not considered historically supportable. What the Egyptian record does confirm is the social infrastructure the sojourn narrative inhabits. The Brooklyn Papyrus, a 13th dynasty document from approximately the 18th century BC, lists Semitic-speaking household servants by name, including names cognate with those found in the Hebrew Bible, confirming the presence of Semitic labor in Egyptian domestic and state contexts well before the Ramesside period. The Leiden Papyrus 348, a New Kingdom administrative document from the reign of Ramesses II in the 13th century BC, records grain rations being issued to Asiatic workers engaged in state construction. Neither document is evidence of the Exodus. Together, they confirm that the world the Exodus narrative describes, Semitic-speaking laborers under Egyptian state authority in the Delta, is documented on its own terms. Excavations at Tel el-Dahba, identified by most Egyptologists with ancient Avaris, later developed as P. Ramesses, have confirmed substantial Semitic settlement in the eastern Delta, with distinctly Levantine material culture embedded within an Egyptian context. Manfred Beitak's decades of fieldwork established this community's scale and duration. The direct identification of this population with the biblical Israelites is not established by the evidence, and scholars are appropriately cautious about drawing that line. Archaeological surveys of the Sinai Peninsula, including systematic fieldwork conducted by Eliezer Oren across the northern and central routes in the 1970s and 1980s, found no confirmed evidence of large-scale migration across the peninsula during the Late Bronze Age. Scholars who accept some historical core to the Exodus account note that pastoral and semi-nomadic groups leave minimal archaeological traces, and that the Sinai remains under-excavated. The observation is legitimate, but the absence of evidence across a systematic survey is, in the mainstream view, the finding, not a gap awaiting resolution. The Merneptah stele, a victory inscription carved by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah around 1208 BC, contains the earliest known extra-biblical reference to a people called Israel, already settled in Canaan. This gives any exodus a firm terminal date before that point. The dating question itself remains genuinely open. A chronological marker in the first book of Kings places the Exodus 480 years before the construction of Solomon's temple, suggesting approximately 1446 BC, pointing toward the reign of Thutmose III or Amenhotep II. An alternative reading, giving weight to the Ramesside-era store city of Ramesses, positions the Exodus in the 13th century BC. Neither framework commands the field. The honest summary is this: Semitic-speaking laborers under Egyptian authority in the Eastern Delta, and a people called Israel in Canaan by 1208 BC are both documented. The mechanism, scale, and route of any departure connecting those two data points is where the evidence runs out and the debate begins. The Exodus is not a story that stayed inside one tradition. Over 3,000 years, it has become the vocabulary of liberation itself, the script drawn on by enslaved communities, colonized peoples, refugees, and everyone who has ever stood at the edge of an impossible situation and been told to move. What makes it endure is not only the drama of the plagues or the spectacle of the divided sea. It is something quieter. A people who do not know how long the road will be, carrying the bones of a man who died in Egypt, trusting a promise he never saw fulfilled, walking toward a land that none of them have ever seen. The promise was made to someone else, generations before they were born. They carried it anyway. The archaeology tells us the ground does not always match the text. The text was never written to be an excavation report. Both of those things can be true at the same time. What sits in the space between them, and why communities across 3 millennia have found this particular story impossible to leave behind, is a question worth sitting with. Thank you for being here. This story has been told. Subscribe and return to Bible Stories Unearthed. The book is open. Let's unearth more.